Hey there, Codefinity here, and in this video I'm talking about Vite again. That's the build tool for the web. Essentially, it takes all of our fancy JavaScript and any other code that we've written, such as React, and it compiles and builds it so that the browser can interpret it as regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So you can check out the Vite page to get an idea of what Vite is. To get started with Vite, we actually run this command down here using a package manager of our choice. It asks a few questions, and it's pretty much as simple as that. Let me quickly show that part. So I ran npm create vite at latest, and I said I wanted a React project, and I selected the JavaScript and React compiler, which is one of the most modern ways to work with React. And that was pretty much it. No experimental stuff. Now, if you would like a link to the actual modified template repo, that is included in the video description. When I say modified, not too much has been changed here. I've put in some custom settings that will do things like automatically help save and format the code. There's some recommended extensions, so you might get prompted in the bottom right to install certain things, including GitHub Copilot, spell checkers, stuff like that. I've also set this up to work with Tailwind, but that's not really part of this video. So that's everything about this template repo. You can just create a basic Vite React template yourself, or you can use this modified version with the linting and stuff like that. Got a whole bunch of additional linting rules in here. Now, of course, if you're watching this video as part of my college course, you'll need to use the actual template repo that's here. You don't get to make your own. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump into the actual code. Or actually, I should show the app, right? I've got that running here. And to get this running, I just ran npm run dev, and there it is. So it's running on this localhost server on 5173 port, and it's running very much like a real live production web server would. So this is essentially a hello world app. All it does is updates the count. So this is a great example just to kind of get the feet wet and start to see what React's about. So now let's jump into the code. Everything starts with HTML. Doesn't matter if you're in React or not. You can't get something in the browser if you don't have HTML. In the HTML, we have this div with an ID of root. If we look in the elements, though, we can see that in the root, there's a whole bunch of other stuff in here. And that automatically tells us that, oh, this is React, this is JavaScript that's rendering all this extra HTML. Because the pure HTML is just an empty div. And clearly, this is not an empty div. So make a note of that. This is pretty standard stuff in React. Over here, when we're working with our HTML, we need to link to our JavaScript file. More specifically, it's a JSX file, and so we use a script tag to do that. We specify type equals module, and that opts us into using modern ECMAScript modules. Now you'll notice here this is JSX, which is what? Which is JavaScript and HTML, which is an XML-like language, combined together. That's what React uses to render things. It's the templating language for React. And the interesting part here is this JSX. Without Vite taking care of our bundling, we wouldn't be able to do that. So Vite is already coming into play here because it's allowing us to work with JSX instead of regular JavaScript. Let's jump into this file here. I'll actually close all the other ones out now. And in here, since we installed and are using React, you would expect to import some of the things from React. So we have this thing called strict mode, and it's capital S, strict mode, which means that it's a component. And we can see that right here. That's what JSX is really all about. It kind of looks like HTML in that we have opening and closing tags, but instead of just the normal HTML tags, we have these capitalized things, which is just a convention, and it lets us know that these are JavaScript rendered components. So it's JavaScript or JSX that's going to be spitting out HTML. Now, strict mode is not really spitting out HTML. It's a special development mode wrapper, and it does some things to help us catch bugs. The next thing we have here is create root. Now this one is regular camel case and it starts with a verb, indicating that it's not a component, it is just a JavaScript function or method, and it's part of what React is providing for us. Here we're doing some more imports. We can see this is some sort of custom component that we'll take a look at. And here's Vite again. Because we're using Vite, we can just pull our CSS in directly into our JavaScript file or our JSX file. So we're finally actually running some code at this juncture and create root. So create root, if we hover over it, it tells us it's a root to display React components inside the browser DOM node. So in other words, we need a place for React to go to work and start mounting our components and rendering things. Oops, I don't want to be in there. I want to be here. So we want to create a root, and that root we're saying, hey, I want you to use this element that's got an ID of root. So this root here is nothing but the ID here. If I was to go in here and change this to roots, our app would immediately crash, and it just would say, oh, I can't find that container to create the root. So there's that. So once we have completed this part of the code, we're going to say, okay, now that you have that root, I want you to render something. Render is what? The word render in the English language essentially means to make something so, to go ahead and do it. So render means to put this into the DOM. Put what into the DOM? Start rendering these components. Strict mode, app. That's it. So that's all that's happening here. Now, you'll never really have to do anything else in here, especially when you're just starting to learn React. This all just comes with the Vite templating, and it's just in there. But you should have an idea of what's happening. So again, all that's happened so far is we've gone into the DOM. We've identified the root. We've created that root for the purposes of React. And we've told React that we want to render in strict mode, and we want to render our app. Let's look at the app component here. And we have this error coming in from the custom settings and the custom linting. We're not going to worry about that for the purposes of this video. We'll just continue on. So here we're importing some more stuff from React. We're importing something called useState. And this isn't too helpful. Returns a stateful value and a function to update it. Okay, I mean, you can click here and learn more about useState. But React is all about hooks. Well, it's about a few things, but one of the things it's about is hooks. What is a hook? A hook is nothing but a function that comes with React that we use. And so the functions, how we know that they're hooks is because they follow this naming. They start with use and then something comes after that. Now, useState is the gateway drug to React. It is the workhorse hook. It's used pretty much every single React app you'll ever create. That's in some capacity. And it's usually the first hook that we introduce. So we'll take a closer look at what that is. So we're importing some more CSS, just some SVG assets. No, don't really care about that. So here we have our function, and it is right here, function app. And this is how Vite writes this out. I don't particularly care for that. I don't know why we have to say export default down here. I would just as soon throw my export default right here. But either way, the point is we're creating our own component. We know it's a component because it's a function with a capital first letter. Again, this is just a convention, but that's how we communicate that this is a component. What is a component? Again, it's just essentially a JavaScript function that's going to spit out and render some HTML code. So we're just going to set that as our export default. And a lot of times starting off with React, this is pretty common. You have a file name, and the name of the file matches the name of your component, and you just spit that out as an export default. Okay, so getting back into the React portion of this, here's useState. What do we have here? What is this pattern? Can you think of it? This is nothing but array destructuring assignment. What does that mean? Well, in order to go over what this means, let me just not use array destructuring for a minute. I'm just going to say, stuff, and I'm just going to log that stuff. So it is going to break the app, but we should be able to get that log before. So, of course, our app crashed. It says count is not defined, whatever. But let's take a look at what we have here. Here's our stuff. To make it even more clear, I'll put a string in here, stuff. So this is very clearly stuff. So what we did here is we said, hey, I'm going to call useState. I'm going to pass in the number 0, fine. And whatever this function, this hook, whatever it returns, I want to assign it to a variable called stuff. And I just want to log it. So all that said, what is getting returned from useState? An array. What's in the array? Two things. The number 0. Why is it the number 0? Well, let me change this to 110. Now it's 110. So that already is a clue as to what's happening. What's happening is we're calling the function, we're passing in the initial state of the count, or whatever it is that we're keeping track of. The name useState. It's a state management hook. What is state? It's anything that we want to keep track of and respond to in our app. So this app is all about keeping track of the count, and whenever that count is updated, we want to display the new value. It's boilerplate 101 for the useState hook. We want to keep track of something, and whenever that something gets updated by the user or by any means, then we want to re-render a part of our application, the components in our application that are using that piece of state, useState. All right, so we initialize, in this case, a count of 110, and useState will take that and spit out an array. In that array is that same initial value that we used and a special function. This is a dispatch function. We don't really get to see all that in here. We just see it's an array of two things. But if I undo this now that you've seen that it's an array with two things in it, then hopefully this makes a little bit more sense. What are these two things? We're using this array destructuring pattern. The first thing is the actual piece of state. In this case, it's the number 0, and we're going to say, okay, I want to keep track of that, and I want to call it count. The second thing is a special dispatch function, and this is the thing that React uses to dispatch an update to your state. This is always the pattern. So if nothing else, just know the pattern. useState, initial value, spits out an array. The first thing in the array is the piece of state. The second thing in the array is what you use to dispatch an update to that state. Let me do it again like the weird way that I had it before, just calling it stuff. And then I'll say, I'll say stuff bracket 1 and stuff bracket 0. And you'll see the app still works. It still renders and all this stuff. But this is just not a great way to do things, and that's why it's very common to use array destructuring. useState gives us an array with two things in it, so I'm going to pull out the first item and give it a name of whatever I want. In this case, count is a great name. And the second item in this array, I'm going to name it with this pattern, with set and then count. In this case, count and set count. So useState always returns an array, two things in it. The first thing is the piece of state. The second thing is the dispatch function. That's it. If you don't know anything else about React, learn that. All right, so moving back in here, we have some components, which in this component code or JSX code, which it's not really anything happening here. It's really just HTML, so we'll skip past all this. Finally, we get to this button, and we add an on-click handler. So yes, in React, we commonly use inline on-click handlers. So we say on-click. Whenever there's a click, we want this function to run. What does this function do? It calls the set count. Now, what's all this in here? You can kind of read that and make sense of it. Let me change this to count plus 10. Now, if I click this thing, it's going to change by a value of 10. So that gives you an idea of what's happening here, but I'll add a couple of comments. In fact, you know what? Rather than comments, I'm just going to change the way that this reads. I'm going to say previous count. There we go. I think that naming just helps right there to illuminate what's happening. So what's happening? We do the on click, and it calls this function. And in this function, it calls that special useState dispatch function. And what does that do? It takes a callback function inside of it. What does that do? Well, it takes the previous count and returns a new value, which is the previous count plus 1, or plus 10, or plus 100, whatever it is. So just with that, we can see how useState works. You call useState, you give it the initial value, it gives you an array with two things in it. The first thing is the piece of state. The second thing is the function that you use to dispatch an update to that piece of state. So again, coming back in here, you wire it up to the button on click, you call that set count, and you say, hey, you're keeping track of the state, right? I hope you are, because you're the useState hook. So now I want you to use this dispatch function. I want you to look at the previous count, and I want you to return a new value, which is the previous count plus 1. As soon as that happens, as soon as we dispatch this update to the state, React will automatically re-render the count, anything that uses count, which is right here, count is count. That's really the crux of what's happening here. One more time, use state, initialize it, array. First thing in the array is the state. Second thing is the dispatch function. Wire it up, button, on click, callback function. The callback function calls set count. I would actually put some braces around this thing because on click itself isn't really returning anything. There we go. So on click, we'll call the dispatch function. The dispatch function will use a callback, take the previous count and return the previous count plus 1. That's going to dispatch an update to count, useState. And so since the count is updated, the button gets re-rendered again. Just the button. That's the beauty of React. Not the whole application, just the part that's relevant to the piece of state.